I try not to set my expectations too high because usually that leads to disappointment, but I'll admit I had pretty high hopes for Yae Miko's gameplay design. I've never really found myself to enjoy Catalyst users in Genshin, so seeing as she's always been a fan favorite and was set to be a DPS based Catalyst user, I really wanted the developers to go all out in terms of making her gameplay interesting. Well, after playing her and getting a feel for her kit, I am sad to say that I don't really enjoy playing her. She has a few glaring design issues that are impossible for me to ignore when playing her, which is the topic of discussion in today's video. Just a reminder that I am purely focusing on gameplay design here, how the character feels to play and how they function within the game. I will not be touching on the character's place in the meta, which is typically dictated by pure DPS potential and interactions with other characters. Alright, let's start with the obvious one, her elemental skill, which causes Yae to dash while placing down a Sessho Sakura. It will periodically strike enemies with electro damage, and when multiple are placed close together, the damage is increased, maxing out with a total of 3. Now, the fact that this ability has 3 charges that requires 3 separate ability casts isn't a problem in and of itself. My issue is that there is literally never any scenario in which you wouldn't want to use all 3 charges at once. This is why the way the ability is used feels completely unnecessary. To better understand this, let's look at an opposite example in Shenhe's elemental skill. You have the option to either press or hold the button, with each one being better than the other depending on the situation. Tapping gives you safe, immediate damage and allows you to quickly give your party her cryo damage buff. On the other hand, holding gives you a more damaging skill and a longer duration on her cryo buff, with the trade-off of having a slower, more vulnerable cast and a longer cooldown. It's a relatively minor example, but this shows how a player is given the freedom to evaluate the situation and act accordingly. On the other hand, Yae having the choice of how she wants to lay down Sessho Sakuras is virtually irrelevant. Leveling up the Sessho Sakura from 1 to 3 increases its damage by a significant amount, a 34% difference per hit at talent level 1 and 61% at level 10. Placing down a single one by itself has no merit to it whatsoever. It's not even like you would add a third one to your existing 2, because it only ever makes sense to place them when you have 3 charges ready, and in that case they will all expire at the same time anyway. Now, none of this would be an issue if not for the fact that the relative positions of the Sessho Sakura weren't also pretty much irrelevant. The only condition you need to follow is having the 3 be relatively close to each other. When I first found this out, all I could think was, really? That's it? Because there was so much potential there. Just imagine how much cooler it would be if, for example, placing them down in a line did massive single target damage on each end, while placing them in a triangle did damage to all enemies inside. But no, instead we got a run-of-the-mill turret type ability. It's just that we have to assemble it ourselves like it's IKEA furniture. I have a feeling the developers might have overestimated the usefulness of having 3 dashes. You're not going to focus on using them to dodge attacks since you'd potentially be messing up your damage and ability rotations. And because there is no intangibility period like on your standard sprint, you just feel very vulnerable during the whole process despite it not taking very long overall. To me, it just seems like there is no good reason for this ability to be split into 3, when from a gameplay design standpoint, having it on one cast would effectively produce the exact same result but with a better feeling user experience. But an elemental skill is only half a character's kit, so how does Yae's elemental burst come into play? Well, it doesn't help very much. In fact, one could argue that it makes things even worse. It's very plain to see that a majority of Yae's power budget lies within her high damaging burst, which consumes her existing Sessho Sakura to do massive AoEs of electro damage. Yae's first Ascension passive resets the cooldown on her elemental skill when this happens though, so at a glance it seems pretty inconsequential, but let's break it down completely. This passive effectively allows you to reset the duration of your Sessho Sakura since you can immediately replace them. Funnily enough, Kokomi's first Ascension passive does the same thing, but in a way that makes way more sense. Hers just straight up refreshes the duration, which due to the ability's 12-second base duration and 20-second cooldown, means that by timing her burst effectively, you can extend her elemental skill's uptime from 60% to 100%. With Yae though, by the time her Sessho Sakura expire, after 14 seconds, she will already have regained all 3 charges of her skill. Of course, her elemental skill being able to have 100% uptime by itself is great, but it means this mechanic of her burst doesn't benefit her as much as you'd think it would. The reason the elemental skill cooldown reset on the sacrificial weapons are highly valuable is because they can refresh long cooldowns, and because they allow you to generate a lot more energy very quickly. Yae generates energy over time through the uptime of her Sessho Sakuras, making neither of these properties applicable to her. It would be different if her elemental skill itself had more of a use or some varied functionality, but it really is just an inconvenience to set it up again. There is no good reason for this type of reset mechanic, it's just uniqueness for the sake of being unique. In fact, the entire ability is pretty much that, since there is no meaningful reason to have the burst consume the Sakura to begin with. Whereas other characters have Ascension passives which define and enhance their playstyles, Yae's basically just gives her the solution to a problem which didn't need to exist in the first place. I could be wrong about this, but doesn't her second Ascension passive also seem to be a bit off? It makes her Sessho Sakura damage additionally scale off of her elemental mastery, which kinda makes sense because the constant electro application can create lots of reactions, but her kit as a whole doesn't really seem to be geared towards that. Her Ascension stat, signature weapon substat, and free-to-play event weapon substat are all standard offensive stats, and the damage from her burst isn't coming from her reactions. Her kit's design seems to suggest prioritizing building crit, attack, and energy recharge for her own damage, ignoring reactions because electros don't crit and don't scale with attack. This makes Yae's passive seem a bit contradictory. I personally think alternate scalings are best reserved for being the focal point of a character's kit, effectively allowing their primary stat to offset their weaknesses in other areas, and everything about the character, like their Ascension stat and main weapons, are meant to play off of this. I guess it's neat that it gives Yae some synergy with elemental mastery boosting supports like Sucrose and Albedo, but with her having an alternate scaling which only applies to a portion of her entire kit, and it being based off one of her low priority stats, I feel like again, it's an Ascension passive that just doesn't add a whole lot of value to her. I really don't want this to be the case, but it's hard to ignore the fact that Yae's confusing design seems to also incidentally justify the existence of her signature weapon, the Kagura's Verity. Because if you think about it, her skill having 3 separate charges isn't very meaningful for her own kit, but it does mean she can make use of this weapon's passive. To get the max elemental damage bonus, you need to activate your elemental skill 3 times within a short period. If I'm understanding this correctly, only Yae and Lisa can actually make use of this. There are other Catalyst users who can just barely use 3 elemental skills in 16 seconds, but they would only have the extra bonus for a few short seconds. This weapon is perfectly designed from the developer's perspective because it serves its purpose as being the undisputed best in slot for its intended character, while also not being too good on a bunch of other characters. The thing is though, that its passive is so niche to the point where I can't even feel like it'll work well on other future characters like with other weapons. Obviously, the crit damage substat will make it strong regardless, but using something that doesn't synergize well is infinitely better than having a weapon with a passive you are just straight up locked out of. Well, either way, the bottom line is that characters should be designed in a way that makes sense for them, not in a way that guarantees exclusive synergy with their signature weapon, assuming that that is the case here. So I have a few ideas for minor tweaks that could greatly improve the feeling of Yae's gameplay, since despite what I've said, there is a solid foundation there. I already mentioned how making the orientation of the Sessho Sakura more important would be really cool, though it would admittedly be much more difficult to implement. Something like this though would completely nullify all the issues I have with Yae's kit, since it would give meaning to her elemental skills design, and the reset from her burst would make sense in the context of being able to adjust the setup. However, Yae's elemental skill could also be improved in a few other ways. For example, giving the dash an initial hitbox on cast that immediately grants some energy. This would make way more sense for why the Sessho Sakura are reset upon bursting, since it would allow you to farm more energy and onto Yae directly for that 90 cost burst. An alternate quality of life change could be to give Yae invincibility frames on her elemental skill so that you can set up Sessho Sakura in an opportune moment when you are being attacked. This would make it feel less like setting them up is a waste of time that your other characters could be better utilizing. It would also give players a reason to use this ability outside of just placing down the Sakura. I mean, she literally disappears from the screen, and Mona's held elemental skill has iframes, so it's not completely unheard of. Alternatively, for her burst, I think the existing Sessho Sakura contributing to the damage is fine, but rather than being consumed, they might as well just have their duration extended to maintain the flow of gameplay. I haven't felt this strongly against a character's gameplay design since Yoimiya. Even though Raiden Shogun and Kokomi had really bad community reception upon their releases, I refrained from talking about them because I thought that despite not immediately being seen as meta, that they were designed well and fulfilled their own niches in the game. But to me, Yae Miko doesn't do that much to create her own identity as a character, because the things that make her unique aren't fun or intuitive by design. It's like they started off on the right foot, creating the foundation for something that could have been truly very interesting, but then they got cold feet halfway through and ended up with something bland. I'm not always bothered by characters not having what I would consider perfect design, but for a limited 5-star character, I do expect a certain level of quality. Now, I usually don't make these videos on characters released so recently, so it is very possible that I might have been incorrect on some specific details. If that is the case, please feel free to correct me, but I do think my overall argument and standpoint will remain no matter what. But that's all from me for this video. I hope you found this interesting or insightful, and as always, thank you for watching.